Good morning, everyone, on this bright Saturday morning in May. Wishing we could have been together as planned, but life had other plans for us, and here we are doing this webinar on Saturday, May 2nd. So I'd just like to say thanks to everyone who took the time to make the time on the weekend to join us. And we had some tiny technical difficulties, which I'm starting to believe is just part of this process. I think you might as well count on it than expect not. But I want to welcome Paul and just tell him again, he always has a great background to these shots. I don't know, really colorful, bright. But welcome, Paul, and just wanted to say good morning to you. How are things?
Good morning. Well, things are better now that we got the video working.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. So we're not going to delay. We're going to get right into the conversation. Paul's going to be presenting on his article, Avoiding Racial Equity Detours. And so we have 25 or 26 people joining us today. So what I want to do is encourage you to send your questions to us as Paul's presenting, and as much as possible, we'll try to integrate them and make it as interactive as possible. And we'll save some time at the end of the presentation to do what we normally do, which is have a question and answer period. But if you send questions along the way, and you don't have to, but you certainly can, I'll try to flip those to Paul, and so he can answer those accordingly. And the other thing, I just want to start, we're not going to do a whole lot of interview questions as we normally would, but I guess one thing I'm just wanting to check in with Paul on, especially given the topic that we're talking about today, and just the recent challenges, that's actually a mild word, challenges with COVID-19, how it's impacting vulnerable and marginalized populations even more so. I guess what I'm wondering, Paul, just from where you're sitting right now, do you feel that this is going to finally shine a light on the ways in which racialized communities and other vulnerable populations always struggle? I mean, it's exacerbated now. Well, that's a big word for Saturday morning. It's exacerbated now, obviously, under these circumstances, and we see the health and the toll that it's taking on people. So are you optimistic, pessimistic, or somewhere in between in terms of how this is going to play out post COVID-19?
I'm pretty much always somewhere in between. I mean, I think it's going to be the same struggle that always exists because, you know, even as people like us are thinking about, well, how can we move forward with the concern and the heightened consciousness? There are other people who's trying to figure out, how can I profit off of this? I mean, I know in the US, my big fear is that this is going to result in a lot more privatization of public schools, and particularly online schools. And the other thing is, you know, I think for people who are relatively privileged or relatively protected from some forms of structural oppression, it's easy to forget that, you know, that we might think of this as a crisis, as a new kind of crisis, and maybe it's a new kind of crisis, but crisis isn't new.
No.
To people who are experiencing poverty, people who are experiencing structural racism, and those sorts of things. And maybe now people are paying attention in a different way because it's a crisis that's touching them. And, you know, so occasionally stuff like this comes along and you want to think, okay, well, this is going to start the conversation we should have been having all along. And somehow it always seems to just reproduce what already exists. So, you know, I think if we organize well and organize some way to push things, maybe that will help.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I kind of go back and forth between being optimistic because it does present us with an opportunity to really rethink our paradigms and the way that we do things and the essential economy. We know now who is critical to our survival and the value that they have. On the other hand, you hear other folks saying, well, governments are going to be bankrupt, companies and businesses have gone down the tubes, so we're going to see austerity like nothing before. And I think you hit on something really important for most of the people today, the fear of the privatization of education. I know you guys are further down the road on that, but we've been presented with e-learning even before this hit, and a real push for that from our government in Ontario, and it is a very challenging and scary time for everyone. So with that, I think we've just identified the topic for our next webinar, perhaps post-COVID, and how we survive and how we push for the changes that we know need to happen and have always needed to happen. But we won't delay any further. So Paul, I'm going to pass it over to you, and you will be now the presenter, and so you will have your PowerPoint that you can upload.
Okay.
And then I believe you can share your screen from your end. You must be able to because you're the presenter now.
This still lists you as the presenter, actually.
Okay. There we go. And then you have to accept that. Yeah. Is that coming up?
Oh, shoot. But now it's trying to move the recording to me. Oh, okay. I think I got it now.
Yeah.
Like to capture. Oh.
And it should say share screen.
Okay.
It's okay.
Am I sharing my screen right now?
No, actually what's still up is the event landing page.
How about now?
Let me see what people are seeing. Yeah, I'm not seeing it, so that's why I'm wondering. Okay, sharing webcam audio dashboard. That's bizarre. It always goes over really easily.
Okay, it lists me as the presenter, but I don't see anywhere to share, to do a screen share.
If you actually just bring if your PowerPoint's open to where you want to start, it should show.
PowerPoint's open.
Okay. So
Show my.
there we go. Oh, there it is. There's a delay sometimes, so now you can see it.
You see my screen?
Yep. Yeah, so as long as you put it in PowerPoint presentation mode, then we'll see what you want us to see. And it's on, yeah, there we go. Now we got it. Yay! We've conquered it. Okay, so I'm gonna step out of here for now, and I'll be watching for questions, everyone. So enjoy the presentation.
All right. Sorry about that snafu, everybody. I think we're rolling now. So I thought a good topic for this webinar would be based on an article I wrote last year called Avoiding Racial Equity Detours. And the reason I'm trying to do some presentations about this is because I wrote this article for Ed Leadership, which is the magazine of ASCD, which is a big organization in the US, but because, you know, their magazine only allows pretty brief articles. And so I had to actually take out, I had to actually remove from that article some of the pieces that I wanted to include. And I thought this would be a way to just expand on some of the ideas in there. And people always, like, the most questions I get from people are about this article. So I'm going to sort of talk through some of the main points in the article and specifically walk through the detours. And in order to make this interactive, I have some prompts along the way that I'll ask you all to respond to in the chat box. And so we can kind of see what each other is thinking about these sorts of things. Feel free to post questions anytime, and we'll just stop and answer the questions. You don't have to wait until the end. And so I guess we'll see how this goes.
You can see the questions in the question box as well.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
And
Okay.
and we can expand those so that it's easier for, it's really hard to see unless we expand it, so I can expand it, and if I need to, I'll stop you.
Okay, sounds
I won't
good.
interrupt you otherwise, though.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, so I wanted to start with an initial question, and I would love for people to respond in the chat box if you have a response. I'm going to give you a little bit of time. One thing that I'm really interested in is what are the barriers? What are the biggest barriers to progress around anti-racism and racial justice in schools? What are the things, you know, it seems like we have, at least some places, we have a pretty big number of people putting some effort into it. So what explains the fact that we're not making progress? I know white supremacy explains it and those sorts of things, but in terms of within educational institutions. So here's a question I would just like to start with. In your school or your district or board or organization, what do you think are the biggest barriers to racial equity, to making progress around racial equity? What have you experienced as the biggest barriers to that? I'd love if anyone has a thought, just type it into the chat box there.
The one response, Paul, we had is the tradition, slowing down to meet the slowest, most reluctant person.
And that's
Also,
definitely one of the detours that we'll talk about.
we've got several coming in, so this is great. A belief that progress has been made, and that is sufficient for now. So we're making progress, and that's good. Third one, a fear and refusal to even begin this conversation. Leaders say they need someone to control the conversation.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are all things that we'll touch on as we kind of go through.
Here's one that I hear, and also one that someone says they hear. This is not an issue for us. Our population is not that racially diverse. Let's focus on poverty and other things, but not race.
Yeah, that's definitely going to come up again. You know, it's interesting too, because I hear that so often. I'll get a call from a school and we want you to come out and work with us on equity. And they'll say to me, something along the lines of, we don't have much racial diversity here. Or they might even say, we are not a diverse school. We are not a racially diverse school. Or even that, I've even had people say, we have no racial diversity at our school. And that's almost never true, first of all.
Mhm.
Often people will say that, and then I'll go to the school, and turns out there are people who visibly are people of color there, students of color. Um, and, I think what they're saying is that I think that, that last comment is really what they're getting at, is that we really would feel more comfortable if you came and talked about class instead of talking about race. So that we'll come back to that. And I think another question, sort of getting at the kind of deep equity view, is that what are the ideologies that underlie those barriers? So what we're naming are sort of the symptoms of ideologies or structures or systems. And one of those ideologies is white supremacy. One of those ideologies is just about, I want to get credit for creating the illusion that we're doing something about equity without actually having to do something serious about anti-racism. And I like talking about that piece, the ideological piece, because if all we're doing is responding to the symptoms of it, the problems that pop up because of the ideology, then we're not addressing the fact that that ideology is informing everything that's happening in the school. It's informing the curriculum, it's informing the policy, it's informing everything. So, when we identify one of these barriers, it's really important to get at, well, what is the root of this barrier? What underlies the barrier? Because that belief system or ideology or whatever it is, that's informing everything else. So if we don't shift that, we might be able to make one little change, but everything else is still going to keep being informed by the same racist belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
So
We have a number of other comments. I'm not sure.
okay, go for it.
Go for it. Okay.
It's weird because I have my chat box open, but these aren't popping up for me.
Look in the questions.
Yeah,
You
I'm
see
in
the
the questions. Nothing's popping up for me for some reason. I don't know.
Okay, so that's fine. So here we go. And this is similar to what was said before, choosing to always remain at the intro to equity stage, because we believe we always have to start at the beginning and the basics for people. So I think that's kind of been said in a different way, but one of the issues, oh, go ahead. Yep.
Well, I was going to say, I see that too. I see in a lot of institutions, they're kind of doing diversity 101, and often not even a good version of diversity 101, over and over and over again. And that's part of that pacing for privilege detour that we'll talk about.
Definitely. Let's see, currently distractions from COVID, economic realities, blocking access to equity. So that's a ramped up version of what we normally see.
Right.
A reluctance on the part of administrators to not make people too uncomfortable or to meet people where they're at. So that's similar to the first one, the previous one. Let's see. One barrier is people are only looking through their own lens and missing other people's voices and perspectives.
Yeah, those are all great points.
Yeah.
And actually, all of those will be hitting on all of those things. So y'all are doing a really good job of sort of predicting what's coming up.
Here's one that's slightly different. Like, we've got a lot of chats here. So fear that people will do more harm than good if they enter the work without complete and comprehensive knowledge. So that one is different than the others that are coming up. And this is something that we talk a lot about in our work. So what do you say to that fear and how it keeps things from happening? And is there some some relevance to the idea that, if we aren't going to do this properly, why are we going to do it at all?
Well, I think the response to that is that leaders need to put this work in the hands of people who are knowledgeable about it. The sort of other side of that concern is, in all these schools, there are people who could say, here are the racist policies in this school. What are we doing about it? And the problem is those people are usually marginalized in their own schools because they're raising those concerns. So the easy fix to that is to say, okay, while we're bridging everybody else to the level of consciousness that they need, let's put the institutional transformation power in the hands of the people who do have the knowledge so that they can be creating the change that we can create while we're waiting for everyone else to get on board. And then there's got to be a commitment to getting everyone on board. So then if we're doing diversity 101 over and over and over again, then we're not moving people in a direction to be able to do the work well. I would also say that in a way, that's kind of a hiring issue. If I'm in a school that says we're committed to equity, then we should be hiring people who are committed to equity. So they're ready for a more sophisticated conversation. And so I wonder, like they're in Ontario and here all over the US, to what extent are people being hired because they're bringing that consciousness, or at least an openness to that consciousness? To what extent is that? To what extent are the people hiring people? Do they even know how to identify that in the people that they're hiring? But that's a fear that I hear a lot. I hear that from individual people. Like I'm worried that I'm going to do more damage. And I think if we're putting the power, like I see a lot of schools that have like these diversity committees that are populated primarily by people really with no expertise in equity and justice. And I think a lot of times those committees are doing some damage, in the school. So in that sense, I do think it's a real concern. But the institution can't wait for all those people to catch up. That I think that's the challenge.
Okay.
So those are great, great opening comments there. Wow. Okay. I got
I
to be
think
on the top of my game here this morning.
for Saturday, right?
Yes. So, so I just want to say a little bit about a little bit more about the topic. Like I said, I'm kind of just expanding on the article. I know many of you have read the article that was in Ed Leadership. And a lot of the ideas in that article, I mean, I cited these people in the article, but a lot of these ideas are things people have been talking about. Gloria Ladson-Billings wrote one of my favorite articles ever. It's from 2006, so it's a little dated, but and it's cited in the article, but it's called "It's Not the Culture of Poverty; It's the Poverty of Culture." And one of the detours is actually built on that article. So that's where some of these detours came from. They came from things that I observed, but also things that other people are writing about. Rita has written about the ways that advocates, especially advocates of color, teachers of color who are advocating for racial justice, are often treated in their schools. And she's written in one of her articles where she interviewed people like that and talked, and in there she talked a little bit about the blowback that they get for doing that. So I'm drawing on a lot of existing knowledge. And another place I get these is, I've been going around the country doing these focus groups with groups of students from various identities that are marginalized identities. And a lot of these come from things that I'm hearing over and over in these focus groups, where I'm asking students, well, how are things going around equity and racial equity in your school, and the stories that they're telling, to me, a lot of which revolve around, well, the school says it's committed to this, but it looks to me like we're doing something else, where I'm still waiting for the school to actually do something about the racism I'm experiencing. So, and then just a little bit more about kind of my, just framing this a little bit. To me, the first question, and those of you who are in the workshop, whenever that last workshop was, when was that? I can't remember. When I was there for 2 days?
November.
November. I do remember it was cold. So, so to me, you know, and this gets to a lot of the comments you all already made. To me, when it comes to the conversation about racial equity and racial justice in schools, you know, the first question we should be asking is, how is racism operating here right now? What are the ways racism is operating in this school right now? Now, I know not everyone's going to be able to knows how to answer that question. Not everyone has the tools, the conceptual tools to answer that question. But I think the problem is in a lot of racial equity work is that, you know, maybe we start with individual reflection, and then maybe we go to, let's talk about the history of how racism has impacted schools, and maybe we go to something around cultural competence, or you know, pick somebody who is racially different from you, sit across from that person and look in their eyes and see yourself reflected in their, you know, soul, you know, those sorts of things. Now, all of that can play a role, but the problem is what happens in a lot of frameworks is that we go through a year or 2 years or 3 years of that, and we've never had a conversation about what are the policies in this school that are doing damage to communities of color right now? What are the practices that are doing damage to racialized students right now? And I think that framework is really built around some of the concerns that you all have already named, which is, you know, how do we do this in a way that feels like we're moving forward, even if really maybe we're moving a little bit forward, but we're going to hit a wall because we're never getting to the crucial question. And so that's really what the article is about. How can we avoid those detours and get to the question? Now I know that all of us who are following those detours, you know, many of us are really committed to racial justice. This is not a question, you know, this is not about shaming us, but it is a question about, you know, we know that some of the barriers are rabidly racist people who are holding up the conversation, but some of the barriers are also the things that we're doing, the people ostensibly committed to racial equity are doing or not doing. And so how do we have a conversation about how to maximize the transformative potential of our racial justice efforts in schools and how to avoid those detours? So this is about reflection. It's not about shame. It's about reflection. How do we do better? It's about a sense of urgency. I also realize that some of these detours really present more of an institutional view than an individual view, but I think they can all be applied also to kind of an individual view. So,
Paul, just while you
yes.
take a drink of water, can you remind people the name of Rita Coley's article?
Um,
If you don't know it now, you can send it to us later and I'll send it out to
I
everyone.
don't, but if anybody has my article handy, you can just look in the references, and you can, and someone maybe can type that into the chat box. It's cited, and I believe, Yvonne, if I remember correctly, you emailed everyone a copy of that Racial Equity Detours article, right?
Yes, and actually I see it now and I'll send it to people in the chat. It's called Behind School Doors: The Impact of Hostile Racial Climates on Urban Teachers of Color. Is that the one?
Right.
Yeah, okay, I'll send that out to everyone.
And I think everybody should read everything by Rita Coley. She's one of my favorite people who is kind of pumping out scholarship about these topics. So what I want to do now is share a couple of stories that came out of focus groups. Now, some of you have probably heard me share one or maybe even both of these before, but these really give a sense of what led me to thinking, okay, we need some sort of way to just kind of hone in on these detours. So this is a story I share in a lot of my workshops. This happened at a school in the northeastern part of the United States, but it's similar to things that happen in a lot of contexts when I'm working with schools. So my organization, the Equity Literacy Institute, was hired to go into this school and help them do an equity audit or an equity assessment. So to do these audits or assessments, we collect a bunch of data, we gather data that they already have, and we analyze it based around a question. So that question might be something like, to what extent is this school an equitable and just environment for all members of the school community? So we're at this school and doing focus groups to try to, as part of trying to answer that question. The very first focus group we did was with a group of African American students. And one of the things we asked them was just, how are things going here around your equity efforts? The other thing that was happening at this school was that they had this big diversity and inclusion initiative. So we asked them, how are things going around that? So the first student who responded said something to the effect of, I feel like a visitor in my own school. The student said something along those lines. Another student said, I feel hyper visible, but I also feel invisible. So, when we're doing one of these diversity programs, or, when slavery comes up in the curriculum and I'm expected to speak for my whole group, I feel pretty hyper visible. The rest of the time, I feel pretty invisible. So we're hearing stories like that. And then right toward the end of the focus group, a young woman who's, you can tell she's sort of getting frustrated. She slams her fist on the table. African-American young woman slams her fist on the table and says, there's racism at this school and nobody's doing anything about it. So I want you to think about how the students at this school with the least amount of power to change institutional culture, how they were framing what the problem was that we needed to solve. They're framing it as, I'm invisible, I feel like I don't belong here, institutional culture is shutting me out, I'm experiencing racism here and nobody's doing anything about it. Right, so think about how they're defining the problem. They're defining the problem as racism. What are we doing about racism at this school? Right, and that's one of the places where we at the Equity Literacy Institute decided this is the question we're going in with. How is racism operating in this school right now? That's the first question, not the question we get to in 3 years. That's the first question. So everything we do is about learning how to answer that question, then answering that question, then making changes based on the answers to that question. Okay, so right after that, we go into a focus group of the upper level administrators in the school. And the reason I have a picture of that tie in the PowerPoint is because the principal is wearing that tie, the principal of the school. He's a former diplomat. He is, middle-aged white guy. His office is decorated like a shrine to diversity. He's got, the Unity Through Diversity poster hanging behind him. He's got the safe space sticker on the door, So we're in this focus group with him and the other upper level administrators, and we asked them, well, how do you think things are going here around racial equity and with this diversity initiative? So the principal leans back in his chair and he kind of straightens out his tie. And he says, what we need to do here is celebrate the joys of diversity. And I thought, aha, this is your gap. Because, you know, they're obsessively talking about the achievement gap. They're obsessively talking about the test score gap. They're talking about the graduation rate gap. The gap that the students want them to talk about is the experience gap. You know, in order for me to do well at this school, I got to be dodging racism everywhere. Not just people calling me names, but a racist curriculum, biased teachers, racist policies, right? So I want you to be doing something about that. Well, here's the person with the most power in the school, and this isn't even on his radar. What he's thinking is, you know, we need more multicultural arts and crafts fairs. We need more international food fairs. We need more multicultural parades. You know, we need more diversity posters hanging up. That's what he's thinking. That's his frame. And so when we're talking to them about, well, what are the efforts that you're putting resources into for this diversity initiative, all of them were like student programming, student diversity assembly, that sort of thing. The students did not need that, not the students of color. You know, what they needed was stop putting these resources into these fluffy assemblies that really are about, well, we'll talk more about the fluffy assemblies later, and start putting it into eliminate the racist policies that we're experiencing. Right? That's the kind of shift that we need. So the students weren't using the word detours, but that's what they were talking about. It's like I'm going in to this class and we have this whole kindness matters initiative, and I got this racist teacher talking about kindness. That's the kind of stuff that I'm hearing in these focus groups. You know, it's like, oh, I'm going into this anti-bullying assembly at school. And while they're doing the anti-bullying assembly, I'm being bullied in the audience while we're watching the anti-bullying assembly. When is somebody going to do something about that? Right? So that's the shift. And really the detours, you know, naming the detours is just about putting some language around those things. So when they happen, we can name them. You know, we have a name for them. Okay. Okay, so the second story comes from a middle school and in Virginia, also in the United States. So I get a call from the dean of students, who's somebody I happen to know just from, you know, knowing educators in the community. And he gives me a call and he says, you know, Paul, we could really use your help. We have a race problem here. So I said, oh, okay, well, you know, what's the problem? And he said, well, it'll be easier if I can just show you the problem. So if you can come down. So I went to visit the school. And so I go to his office and I say, you know, okay, so what do you want to show me? And he waves me down the hallway and we go walking down the hallway and he swings open the doors of the cafeteria. And there's this table right in front of us that's like right near the entrance to the cafeteria that's African-American students. Then off to the left, there's a table with mostly Korean and Korean American students. There are a lot of international Korean students at this school. So he points to that table and the table of the African American students. And he says, the problem here is that the students of color segregate themselves. Okay, so I look at the table, one table of African-American students, one table of Korean students, and then there are like 10 tables of all white students. And I say, well, it looks to me like the white students are segregating themselves. And John is the name of the dean of students, looks at me and he says, you know, I've never really seen it that way. And I said, that's your gap. You need to learn how to see it that way. His problem was not that he was a terrible, rabidly racist guy. The problem was that he just didn't know how to interpret what was happening right in front of him. So his solution was going to be, I'm going to force integrate the cafeteria. So he's going to force these African-American students and Korean students, some of those students, lunchtime is the only time they feel any sense of comfort in the entire school day. And what he's going to do is take that away from them because he thinks the problem is they're segregating themselves, right? He just doesn't have the lens. He doesn't have the lens. He doesn't have the proper interpretation. So this is also why I talk a lot about ideology, and I'll get to that as one of the principles, that it's not enough just to shift practices. We have to shift the ideology. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that I'm experiencing in schools. I say, okay, we need some names for these detours. We need to be able to name them when we're sitting in a meeting and somebody starts following one. We have to say, oh, okay, that's a detour. Let's catch ourselves with those detours. So what do I mean by equity detours? Things we do that might create the optics of equity progress, our diversity assembly, our anti-bullying program, that sort of thing, without actually creating equity progress. They also might be aspects of institutional culture that in a lot of schools make it harder to be an anti-racist than a racist. This is another thing that I see a lot in schools where people get more blowback for being an anti-racist than they get for just going along with the racism. If you're a school leader or a district or board leader, and that's happening in your sphere of influence, you are failing as a leader. If it is harder to be an outspoken anti-racist in your sphere of influence than it is to just go along with the racism and continue perpetuating racism, you're failing as a leader. Right? And again, a lot of that happens with the detours you all were already sort of naming. Another thing is ways we might avoid the hard work of racial justice by focusing on things that are more manageable, especially for white educators. So again, that might be anti-bullying, that might be cultural competence, that might be celebrating diversity, those sorts of things. Okay, so I'm gonna actually get back to this question. So let's just start talking about some of these detours. The first one, some of you already kind of referred to this in your comments. It's called the pacing for privilege detour. So this means we're pacing our equity work in a way that prioritizes the comfort and interests of white people over progress toward racial equity. And somebody actually, one of your comments was kind of like this, that example of like, oh, we're not ready for that. It's so funny how many people tell me that they tried to share this article with their principals or whoever leader in their organizations and said, we really should do a reading, a group reading of this. And how many times that their principals or whoever said, I don't think we're ready for this article. And that's the point. You need this article because you're saying you're not ready for the article. That's the pacing for privilege detour. You're actually demonstrating a detour in your response to the conversation about the detours. So I'm curious for you all, what are some of the comments or things that you see happening in your own school or board or district or organization that might sort of demonstrate this pacing for privilege detour? I see it in terms of we're not ready for that. Let's soften it. Let's fluff it up. Let's focus on cultural competence or some softer version. And it's not that there's a problem with cultural competence. It's just that cultural competence in and of itself does absolutely nothing to eliminate racism in a school. It might help individual relations, but it doesn't help identify racist policies or practices or those sorts of things. So how have you seen the pacing for privilege? I see a lot of it in professional development, and someone sort of named that as well. Any thoughts?
So a few comments already. There are so many issues, not just race. Our leadership has indicated that making people angry will be inequitable. Oop, I lost that one. They're coming in so quickly, it's scrolling. Our leadership has indicated that making people angry will be inequitable to teachers. A lot of we aren't ready, that the anti-racists are too radical, too harsh. So
Let me talk about the last two that you mentioned. The
yeah.
one about it would be inequitable to, if we make teachers uncomfortable. This is a classic sort of shift of focus. It's like we can never address racism because the argument is that by addressing racism, we're being racist. And that's sort of the classic thing, that's a classic use, sort of a classic shift of language and perspective as a way to ensure that we can never make progress. It's like the discomfort already exists. We're doing the anti-racism because the discomfort already exists. Really, what those people are saying is, I feel okay if these kids who are experiencing racism, I would prefer them to continue experiencing the oppression and the discomfort than me having to experience the oppression, what to me might feel like oppression and discomfort. And really, if we're doing equity work well, we are kind of reallocating the discomfort. We should be taking it off the shoulders of kids. So whenever somebody says, well, we don't want to make people uncomfortable, the response is, we're already making people uncomfortable. That's why we're having this conversation. So what you're saying is, you're okay with these children being uncomfortable. You're okay with these students who are already experiencing the discomfort of marginalization and oppression and racism and transphobia or whatever it is, that you're okay with that because you prefer that over reallocating the discomfort by us, the adults who are paid to do this work. We don't want that on ourselves. I think that's just the biggest cop out. I'm constantly calling people out on that.
Not sure if
And
you
the weird thing is when you call people out, then they think that's evidence of the point that they're making. Yeah, sorry.
So true. No. So the last one I mentioned, but might have got missed. Lots of, and in quotes, we aren't ready, that the anti-racists are too radical and too harsh.
Yeah. Yeah, again, it's like, what is harsh? Is the existing racism harsh? Are you saying or is my response to the racism harsh? I think those are all great examples. That's exactly how pacing for privilege plays out. And again, from an equity point of view, a reallocation of the harshness should be seen as, yeah, we're the people getting paid to do this, so we should be taking on the harshness if there's harshness. And if there's somebody being hurt by racism or sexism or whatever it is, they're taking on the harshness. If we see a response to that racism or sexism or whatever as harsh, we have a serious institutional problem. I need to get all those people in a workshop and explain this to them. So.
That's the next step. So the next one I think is quite well taken and a problem often. Often the conversation gets stuck at white privilege and it becomes about the white people again.
Yeah,
beyond
that's a great point as well. I think a lot of people who have a little bit more critical frameworks have kind of let go of white privilege as being the center of the conversation, because that does tend to happen. And, Oh, it's so hard to be a white person reflecting on my white privilege. I think critical race theory provides a set of tools that might kind of help us get around that a little bit so that we're not constantly recentering that whiteness. So, there might be some other comments, but I think just for the sake of time, we got to keep moving forward here.
Yep.
The second detour, something I talk about a lot, is the deficit ideology detour. I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about this before, but deficit ideology detour is about, when our quote unquote equity efforts focus on adjusting the cultures, mindsets, values, emotions, grittiness of students who are marginalized, students who are racialized, rather than adjusting the conditions that marginalize students, like racism. So instead of eliminating racism, let's help students, minoritized students or racialized students become more gritty, or let's adjust their emotions or shift their mindsets or their cultures. A good example of this would be, I'm sure this happens as well in Canada, but in the US, there are all these studies that show that African American students are more likely to be suspended or expelled from school, and more likely than white students. If I go and look at the ways that schools are responding to that, a lot of it revolves around how do we fix the behaviors of African American students? We need a mindfulness room. We need emotion regulation. We need those sorts of things. The problem is that research shows that there is no disparity in behaviors. The disparity is actually caused by racism. It's mostly about how teachers are interpreting behavior differently through their own racial bias. And then as you go up each step of the process, up to whoever is doling out the bigger punishments like suspension and expulsion, it's about racism in that process. But if you go and talk to schools that are trying to address this as a problem and say, okay, well, what percentage of the schools who are trying to address this as a problem, what percentage of them are using eliminate the racism as their primary strategy? It's virtually zero. I mean, I don't think I've ever found a school in the US whose strategy for this, sometimes the strategy is we're just going to put a moratorium on suspensions and expulsions. We're going to do that. Or we're going to help students manage their emotions better. But rarely is it, we are going to hold racist teachers who are doing this accountable for that. And that's that sort of gap. That's a deficit ideology, focusing on what do we need to shift about the students. Or if we look at outcome data, graduation rate data, what do we need to change about racialized students so that we can close the gap in graduation rates, rather than what do we need to do about the racism that's causing the graduation rates. So I wonder, for you all, again, what are some ways that you've observed this kind of deficit ideology detour in your own spheres of influence? What are policies or programs or initiatives that you see that kind of pass for racial equity, but are actually using this kind of how do we change racialized students approach? I think in the US, grit is probably a big one, and emotion regulation is a big one.
Paul, I'm going to bring a comment forward from the previous question, but it fits for what you're looking at right now. When we finally started a conversation about racism in our school, it turned into an effort to recruit people of color for a mentor program for students, and in brackets, deficit lens.
That's a great example. And another problem with that approach too is that it puts the labor back onto communities of color. to solve a problem that is bearing down on communities of color. As classic, deficit ideology approach. That's a great example.
Mm-hmm. So second one, there's a tendency to blame parents for kids' difficulties in school. Definitely see it in provincial testing for Indigenous families. They just don't value education. So there's a variety of different ways in which this the blame is put back on families and families from particular groups.
That's a great example, especially that not valuing education. I haven't looked closely at the research about this in Canada. I don't know if this is something people have studied a lot in Canada, but in the US, studying this sort of deficit ideology, what's really interesting is that there's this presumption, and Ruby Payne is somebody who kind of uh, helped support this myth that there are certain groups that value education less than other groups. So that could be communities experiencing poverty or various racialized groups or whoever it is, whether it's African American, Indigenous communities, whoever. The problem is that there is not one lick of evidence in the research in the US that actually supports the idea that any of those communities care about education less than others. And what's actually happening there is, again, people interpreting things through this deficit ideology, misinterpreting things through this deficit ideology. So they're interpreting the problem incorrectly. And of course, if I'm interpreting the problem incorrectly, then I have no shot. I'll give you a quick example of this. I was doing some work with a school in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has a big population of Hmong refugees who are sort of, in essence, nationless, considered nationless people, around sort of Vietnam and that sort of region, who are sort of a displaced people. And many of them immigrated to the US. So this one principal I was doing some work at the school, and what he was using as evidence to prove that the families these Hmong families, what we need to do is get them to care about education. And he was using this data that they had collected about who is participating in extracurricular activities, which showed that a much smaller percentage of Hmong students were participating than white students. So he's showing me this as evidence. And I'm asking him, well, what could be an explanation for this other than those families don't care enough to have their kids in their extracurricular activities? And he just couldn't give it. He's just so stuck in this deficit lens. So I did a focus group with among students, and this sort of came up, and I said, I've seen this data about very low participation in extracurricular among Hmong students. And, some of them are laughing. I said, well, so how do you interpret what's happening? And what was actually happening in essence was, why would I want to spend one more minute in that school than I need to spend in that school? Why would I want to connect in any other way than what I have to connect? I mean, look at the attitude of that principal. That principal had a racist attitude about these Hmong students, right? So you think about the institutional culture there. They're like, why would I want to spend 1 second in this freaking building after school or before school to participate in these extracurriculars? That's what was actually going on. But because the principal was so stuck in this deficit detour, he just couldn't or wasn't willing to look at it. And the only way that was going to help him be more equitable as a leader is classic deficit ideology. And it also is a great demonstration of, because a lot of people say, well, I don't want to talk about that ideological stuff. That's so theoretical and philosophical. It's not practical. And that shows how practical that ideology piece is. Because if I have the wrong ideology, I can't interpret what's happening right in front of me correctly. And if I can't interpret what's happening, right in front of me correctly, I got no shot at creating more equity.
So a couple other things that were mentioned in the chat: zones of regulation, mindfulness, restorative circles, and PBIS, which I'm just blanking on. I'm not sure what that is.
That's positive behavioral supports and interventions. It's
Right.
a
So
framework.
those 4 things right there,
Yeah.
without an
Those are all gonna come up again when I
Yeah.
introduce one of the new detours. But those are great examples.
So I just want to make share a comment that was made when you were asking about, what it's like in the US and who's done the work. So one comment was, it's the same in Canada, as teachers put this at the feet of residential schools, not the cognitive imperialism and racism within schools.
Yeah.
So we're not much
Yeah.
different here,
Yeah.
if at all.
Okay.
Great
Great
comment.
point. So another detour I want to mention, and I already kind of talked about this at the very beginning, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, is the celebrating diversity detour. So this is mistaking celebrations of diversity as progress toward equity. Now, the thing that a lot of people will say to me is, well, isn't celebrating diversity a step toward equity? My argument is no, because every step toward equity, every step toward racial equity eliminates racism. So any step we're making toward equity, I need to be able to say, here is the racism this is eliminating. Celebrating diversity by itself does not eliminate racism. It does not eliminate racist policies. It does not eliminate racist practices. That doesn't mean it's not important. It's just on another plane. And I would say the same thing about cultural competence. Not that it's not important, but it's just on a little different plane. It does not identify and eliminate racism. It might help strengthen interpersonal relationships across cultures, which could, in the end, help lead to better anti-racist outcomes. But really quick story from a focus group. Some of you have probably heard me tell this story, but this was at a school in Minnesota. I was talking to a group of middle school students. The very next day, they were going to do this thing called Diverse Friends Day. This is kind of like that story I shared about integrating the cafeteria. So I was talking to these 3 students. 2 of them were Latinx students, and one was an African American student. And the very next day, their school was going to do this Diverse Friends Day, where they were having students during lunch to sit with students they wouldn't normally sit with. So the idea was racially integrate the cafeteria. So I was talking to these students and asking them, well, what do you think about this Diverse Friends Day your school's doing? And one of the students said, well, they're forcing us to sit with the kids who don't like us. So think about that. So in order to do this sort of gentle diversity awareness with white kids, we're in essence going to use these racialized students as props. So white students can learn about diversity, not learn about racism, but just celebrate diversity, right? And what are these students of color getting out of this? So then the other student said, I think this Diverse Friends Day is for the white kids. I think Diverse Friends Day is for white people. And I thought, that is one of the most brilliant pieces of analysis around equity that I think I've ever heard. And this came from a middle school student, who's saying, I really don't need to sit with white kids during lunch to understand diversity in this school. In order to survive being here, I gotta understand this really deeply. So one thing that we could do is go back, and again, I'm not saying we shouldn't celebrate diversity. I'm just saying that function, that celebrating diversity function, has got to be removed from the equity function. And one thing that I see a lot is schools or districts or boards or whoever it is hiring an equity director to do equity work in the district, but also putting that person in charge of all the diversity stuff. So now I got to run Black History Month, and I got to run the student clubs and all of that. And that sort of stuff becomes so busy that I don't really have time to do the thing you hired me to do, which is identify the racism, eliminate the racism. So these functions need to be separated. And it takes a totally different set of expertise to do the institutional work that those people ought to be doing than it does to be planning diversity programs, that sort of thing. But we really shouldn't be doing any of these diversity programs that takes advantage of the labor of racialized people for gentle diversity awareness for other people, especially when we're not doing anything seriously about the racism that that racialized people are experiencing. Okay, so this kind of gets to what some of you, this is a detour that we had to take out of the article. I had to take out a couple of them because I didn't have enough space, but I call this the shiny new thing detour. And this is kind of what y'all were talking about, the PBIS, the SEL, the grit, the growth mindset. This is the sort of cycle of obsessively latching onto popular programs and initiatives that were never really created with racial equity in mind, thinking that they're going to do the racial equity work. So to me, the two clearest examples of this are probably grit and growth mindset. What's interesting is that Angela Duckworth, whose work around grit became really famous in schools, she has come out and said grit is not an equity strategy. Grit is not something you take and apply to students of color or students experiencing poverty or whoever. The idea of grit is not supposed to be applied like that. And yet schools are still, when I go into schools now and say, well, what are you doing around equity? Grit is something that they talk about a lot. Growth mindset, same thing. Carol Dweck has come out and said, growth mindset is not an equity strategy. And really growth mindset should be applied to educators. Do educators believe that students are capable of learning, whatever it is that they're teaching? You all already named a bunch of the other things. To me, a lot of these things, trauma-informed, social emotional, a lot of these things, if we already have a racial justice framework, if we're already committed to that racial justice, then these things can be tools because we're going to use them in racially just ways. If we're on all these detours and we adopt those things, then we're going to implement them in racist ways because we're implementing everything in racist ways. So then even something like restorative practices. Those are all detours if we're using them instead of racial justice. If we're using them with a racial justice lens, if I'm using trauma informed through a racial justice lens, my first question ought to be, what are the ways that we are traumatizing students of color in this school? What are the policies and practices and ideologies in this school that are traumatizing racialized families or LGBTQ families or whoever it is? That should be the first question. If we're embracing social emotional, what is the social emotional damage we are doing to children in this school? That should be the first question. But if I don't start with an equity lens, it wouldn't even occur to me to ask this question. So a lot of that stuff is based on these racist presumptions that, oh, those kids are experiencing all these problems at home, so we have to learn how to be responsive to that in school. I was talking with a student who identified as transgender, who was telling me about that his principal, his school counselor was taking him through this survey because he was struggling with some stuff. And he asked the counselor, well, what is this survey? And the counselor said, well, this is the ACEs survey, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. So asking questions about, have you experienced this? Did you experience that? And the student is telling me the story, and the student said to me, that most adverse experiences I've ever had in my life have been at this school. And the counselor never asked me about that. And that's how we end up applying these things as detours. So the school's not addressing its own transphobia, but the school is saying, well, we need to be responsive to the traumas that this kid has experienced outside of school. That's the sort of shiny new thing, detour. And the thing about this is none of these ever work. And if they did work, we wouldn't keep doing new ones. You know, why are we not talking about emotional intelligence anymore? Because all of those years and millions of dollars that our schools and districts and boards put into emotional intelligence had exactly zero impact on educational outcomes, the thing that we measure impact by. You know, why are we not talking about learning styles anymore? Because research shows that attending to specific learning styles has zero impact on learning. And think about all the resources. And now research is showing growth mindset interventions are having zero impact. These things never work. They never work because we don't attend to the ideology underlying our need to keep adopting these things as crutches, because we're not doing the ideological work to recognize how do we improve as institutions, you know, those sorts of things. So I don't know. Need to take a deep breath because this makes me upset, as you can hear. Okay. But here's the thing to reflect on, you know, because all of us, I think, have a tendency, something cool comes along and it sounds pretty progressive, restorative practices, sounds cool, so I'm going to sort of adopt that. And it can be easy for our identities to start getting wrapped into these things so that it's hard for us to take a step back and say, well, why am I leaning so hard on these restorative practices? Why is this so alluring to me? And how is this helping me maybe detour around something else that I need to focus on? So, you know, I would reflect on that. You know, all of us can reflect on what is the thing that we find alluring, and are we relying on that too much? And what are the things that your colleagues are finding alluring in the same way? Okay. Oh my goodness, I'm way behind. So I call this my shiny thing, racial equity arithmetic. You take all these shiny new things, you start with racism in a school, and then you sprinkle in all these shiny things. And where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us as racism because none of those things does a lick to have any threat against the existence of racism in a school. Right? So that's what we got to be. It again doesn't mean that some of those things aren't important. It just means by themselves, these are not anti-racist initiatives or programs or whatever. So, okay. Whew. How are we doing, Yvonne?
We're doing good. We're 11:20. So you're always behind though, because you have too much to say. So that's okay.
Are we supposed to end at 11:30?
No, at 12.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, good.
Maybe
Good.
you're
Good.
not behind.
I'm going to try to end by 11:30 just to open up the conversation. Okay, poverty of culture detour. So this is, again, this comes from Gloria Latson Billings. The name of her article is, "It's not the culture of poverty, it's the poverty of culture." And what she's talking about there is how these sort of vague, fuzzy notions of culture have become so prominent in conversations about equity uh, in the US. And I've talked about this in my visits to Toronto before, but if you think about all the popular frameworks for thinking about diversity and equity and inclusion, so many of them are just built around this kind of vague cultural nomenclature: multicultural, intercultural, cross-cultural, cultural competence, cultural proficiency, culturally and linguistically diverse, culture of poverty, uh, even culturally responsive and culturally relevant. Now, those last two, culturally responsive, culturally relevant, I think I actually have this on the next slide. culturally relevant and culturally responsive. Now, those two are actually built on a foundation of racial justice. This is Geneva Gay, this is Gloria Ladson-Billings. There's a new framework that was built off of these frameworks called culturally sustaining pedagogies, and these are still using that sort of cultural nomenclature, but they're really built on a foundation of equity and justice. The problem is, and Gloria Ladson-Billings has written about this, when people say they're using culturally relevant pedagogy and invite her into the school and she goes and sees what they're doing, really what they're doing is cultural competence or some fluffy, problematic, it's like, oh, I'm doing call and response with my students, or I'm singing with my students. And so they're leaving out that racial justice piece. So we got to be careful about that too, vague notions about culture. And one thing we got to remember, race is not a culture. Race is a socially constructed sort of idea that was designed for the purpose of white supremacy and marginalizing people. It doesn't mean that racial identity isn't real, and it certainly doesn't mean that racism isn't real. And that's the slippery thing. You know, race isn't real, but racism is very real. And so we have to make sure that we're not conflating cultural diversity or cultural responsiveness or cultural solutions to racism problems, right? We can't solve racism with celebrating cultural diversity, that sort of thing, right? And again, that's put racism at the center, put anti-racism at the center of the conversation. Okay. I could have already talked through all that. So I want to kind of do, oh, and I did want to, I didn't talk about this, but one of you mentioned it earlier, and I haven't written about this, but this is, next time I write about this, I'm going to add this. I think somebody mentioned this at the very beginning, foreshadowing this very moment, that it's about class, not about race, Detour, which is another one that I hear about a lot. Now, I do think that, you know, eventually the best model for this is an intersectional model. However, when I'm working with a school or a district, until they can demonstrate for me that they can put racism at the center and focus on racism without going to every other thing, that I tell them, you're not ready for an intersectional view because you don't know how to focus on this one thing. You're trying to use intersectionality as a detour around talking about racism. That's not what intersectionality is for. An intersectional view to understanding racism is about developing a deeper understanding of how racism operates based on looking at how it intersects with other things. So it's about deepening our view of racism. We can't do that if we don't know how to put anti-racism in the middle of the conversation and focus on that without moving every other place. Okay, so all of these detours, the question I have for you is, what for you is the most prominent in your school or organization, or which one for you might be the hardest one to, you know, to get people to stop embracing, the hardest one to name without getting attacked? I'm just curious.
So while we wait for people to respond to that, I had a question I want to pose to you. Could you kind of explain the key differences between culturally competent and culturally relevant / responsive pedagogy? Because they get interchanged a lot. So culturally competent and then cultural relevant responsive. So culturally responsive pedagogy.
Cultural competence is an older framework that is sort of based around, am I tapped into what my own culture is and my own cultural lenses and how that impacts the way that I interpret and interact with people who are culturally different from me. So that's one piece of cultural competence. Another piece is, you know, knowing enough about cultures that are different from me so that I can appreciate and interact with people who are culturally different from me. So there's part of it that's self-reflective, what's my culture? There's part of it that is uh, outside of myself, what is your culture? How can I understand that well enough so that we can communicate with each other? That sort of cultural competence. Culturally relevant, culturally responsive is really about how do we build educational structures uh, that are responsive to the full diversity of students. So you might think about, like a lot of people talk about culturally relevant pedagogy. How do we build a pedagogy that is relevant to the needs, the interests, uh, the identities of all the students? You know, how do we make it compelling to all students? Same as sort of cultural responsiveness. How do we build educational structures, policies, and practices that are responsive to the individual needs of students who are, you know, where there might be wide cultural diversity. But again, you know, Gloria Latza-Billings, Geneva Gay, people like that, they're talking about that as part of a bigger project about, you know, part of being responsive is eliminating the racism, because part of what students need is to not have to come to school and deal with racism when they're trying to learn. So that's the difference. Culturally responsive, culturally relevant are a little newer. They come from like the 90s, early 2000s. That's when they got rolling. Cultural competence is really old, and that comes from old sort of like intercultural education, intercultural communication models.
Great, thanks, Paul. I think if we were doing a poll right now in terms of the question you asked, the most common detour is obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but pacing for privilege comes up time and time again. Deficit ideology, definitely. Just going through them here. Everyone needing to be on board, so that's another way of saying pacing, I think, for those who maybe are not ready. Shiny new thing. So that one is resonating. You're considered not on board with initiatives and considered difficult if you question the shiny new thing. Dare you
Yeah.
question grit? Dare you question, the idea of resiliency when it's being applied to groups that are marginalized?
Yeah, and I think that part of it is because those things are detours, they're so alluring to people, because it's so much easier to talk about grit and resilience than it is to talk about anti-Blackness or to talk about racism or anti-racism. And that's part of the reason people attach themselves to those things. And you know, that shiny new thing detour, I think also for some of those things is a really big problem with kind of white liberal people who see themselves as very liberal, but are very uncomfortable with conversations about things like anti-Blackness or white supremacy or anti-racism. So they can glom onto things that are kind of these neat liberal sort of things like no place for hate or kindness matters, or you know, some of the fluffier versions of restorative practices or meditation, you know, those sorts of things. They could kind of glom onto that, and so they're sort of they're performing a kind of liberalism there, celebrating diversity. They're kind of performing a kind of liberalism there without having to truly be transformative. Uh, but you know, there's kind of a self-congratulatory thing that happens there.
Mm.
I find that the people who are the most offensive about those shiny new things in conversations about equity tend to be white liberal people who just find them neat. You know, restorative practices are neat, so let's do restorative practices. And they'll say things like, well, we do restorative practices and it has completely transformed the institution. But, you know, when I'm in these schools and I'm talking to students of color about their transformative practices, and they're talking about, hey, we do this morning circle every day and we go around, and hell, I don't trust this teacher. This teacher's, you know, done these racist things. I don't trust that I can say what I'm really feeling in front of this group. And if I do say what I'm really feeling, and maybe that I'm feeling outcast because of racism, the response is invalidating me, you know. So and that's not even true restorative practice. That's not even a real application. So, you know, so I think it's really important. And for those of us who kind of see ourselves as kind of white liberal, we find these kind of neat things alluring. We really got to reflect on why. You know, what do they help us sort of create an illusion of ourselves as being engaged in something way more transformative than we're actually engaged in?
So I want to share a couple more. One, I think you've touched on already. So people saying it's about poverty, not race. And so choosing the other issue ahead of race. And then this I thought was really interesting, and I really tend to agree with it. So most visible and evident detour in my work is pacing for privilege. Most difficult is deficit ideology because it is the least articulated and attached to deeply held beliefs about communities. So it's not often recognized because it's such a deeply held belief about families that or cultural groups, students, that no one wants to question it.
Yeah, that's such a powerful point, and it gets to why when schools and boards and districts bring me in, I'm hitting ideology so hard, and frankly, people get annoyed at that because they want practical strategies, and it's like, but this is your problem. You can't even come up with good practical strategies because you're so stuck in this. And when I work with leaders, you know, one of my main messages with them is equity cannot live in a school where deficit ideology lives. So if you need to nip that in the bud, you need to name it every single time it happens. You don't have to shame anybody. You don't have to wag your finger, but you got to name it. Oh, I think we're following that deficit ideology detour again. Let's get back into that equity view. It's really hard, and because it's ideological, it just passes for normal. So people can't recognize it happening, and that's why, you know, having the language is so important. You know, so I can name that when it's happening. Uh, there's still a lot of resistance sometimes to naming it, but
So here's a couple questions in relation to both this point and your prior one. So how do we respond to show, like, so here's how do we respond to the question that gets asked, show me the proof that racism is happening here. We don't collect data, so how are we constantly going around in circles? And that builds on a previous question, which is the importance of collecting disaggregated data, race-based data when it comes to achievement and other concerns.
yeah, I think we do need data. One thing that I distinguish is achievement data, which are things like test scores, graduation rates, who is being slotted into what class. I think we also need to collect experience data, because we have students who can be doing well academically, but still having a horrible experience. I was working with a school in New Jersey and doing these focus groups, and and one of the students was a African American young woman in this focus group. She was a valedictorian of the school, and I think that that the school put her in the focus group thinking she would say positive things about the school. She's a valedictorian. She was, really popular and all these other things. So she's in this focus group saying, teachers try to relate to me. I'm the valedictorian. I'm popular. And she said, when I graduate from this school, I am never coming back to this place because of all the shit that I've had to deal with at this school every day, multiple times a day, the layers of racism, the ways that teachers patronize me. I'm never coming back to this place. So even if we worked out all the achievement stuff, which I don't think, by the way, is possible without working out the experience stuff, but we need to be collecting experience data. And that happens through things like surveys, focus groups. It's really important if you do focus groups to have somebody who is not connected to the power structure in the school or district, who has no power over the students doing those focus groups. You got to collect experience data, and not just, you can collect some experience data through surveys, but you don't get the depth of it. You can get a sense of sort of, in a way, what's happening, but not really the depth of how it's happening, which you need focus groups and other more qualitative things for. I think it's irresponsible for any school or district or school board to not be collecting experience data. And I think a lot of them don't collect that data because they know what it's going to show. It's going to show that you think you're doing a good job around this stuff, but really not doing such a good job. I would love to come to Canada or really anywhere and do a training about how to collect experience data so people can have strategies for doing that.
Paul, there's a bit of a glitch in the audio just now. Could you say what you said the last couple of sentences?
Oh, I just
Somehow
said,
the microphone didn't pick up what you're saying. It's still not happening.
You can't hear me now?
No.
Can you hear me now? Are you able to hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Go ahead.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, everyone else was hearing, it seems like, but you're fine.
Okay. A
My bad.
participant just texted me and said we can hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying that that I think it's irresponsible for schools not to collect experience data, and that I would love to start doing workshops about how to collect experience data, not just achievement data. So okay, so shoot, we don't really have time for this. I was going to talk about some of the basic equity principles, but these are all in the article. Maybe I'll just do like a really quick run through of these. Direct confrontation principle. Basically, the idea for the principles is if we can sort of buy into a set of these principles, they can provide sort of guidelines for avoiding the detours. If we could just embrace an equity approach that's guided by just a few ideals or values, it would really help us. So direct confrontation principle, this is not about directly confronting people, although we have to do that sometimes. It's about directly confronting racism. How is racism operating? How do we eliminate racism? So if our goal is racial equity, we need to avoid any strategy, program, initiative that is not about identifying racism, eliminating racism, and then cultivating actively anti-racist initiatives, strategies, practices, those sorts of things. Right, that's the direct confrontation principle. So anything that takes us off of that road, anything that's about identifying the racism and then help students adjust to the racism. Okay, now I realize I'm off of that road. I'm off of the direct confrontation road. Let's get back onto that road. Prioritization principle. this is sort of the equivalent of that equality versus equity thing. Prioritization principle is we have to actively prioritize the interests of racialized students and families of color, not here's what, dominant identity students have access to, let's just try to even it out, because we have to make up for the whole history of cheating people out of access and opportunity. So, how do we start developing policies and practices where we're like, how are we actively prioritizing the interests of students whose interests historically have never been prioritized? That lens should go into every policy, every practice, and you do that until there's some, until we've gotten to a point of equity and justice. And this is, to me, the problem with defining equity as just give all students access to what they need, because I think it takes that institutional view out of it. Again, what students need is to not experience racism. That's different from me having an individual, like, what do I need to do to help this individual student? So that's a prioritization principle. That's the principle I get the most pushback on, by the way. The equity ideology principle, I've already talked about this. Any sustainable shifts in practice have to be contextualized in ideological shifts. So, giving teachers with racial biases 5 strategies for communicating better with, racialized students, that is not going to create more racial equity. So equity work has really got to begin with ideological shifts, and then we build the practical shifts on those. Finally, the fix injustice, not kids principle. This is the flip side of the deficit ideology detour. So racial justice efforts should never be about adjusting students or families of color. They should always be about transforming the conditions that marginalize and oppress students and families of color. So if we could just embrace, there are more principles that you can find if you do a web search for basic equity literacy principles. I think these are the 4 sort of core principles. So I think I'm gonna just end here and see if there are any questions or thoughts, things people want to share.
Just, Paul, going back to an earlier comment about equity detours, I thought this one we didn't get to mention, but administrative teams that don't support the work or acknowledge the structural systems that need to be addressed. A very kind of, it stagnates the work, and it really frustrates those who want to make a difference. Keeping it kind of more on an individual program focus without really wanting to embrace the structural systems.
One thing that is hard is that in racist structures, anti-racist people generally are not hired to be leaders in racist systems.
Mm-hmm.
And often, so what you end up having often are, but we do want to hire leaders who can create the illusion, because we know the illusion of equity is going to be prioritized over actual equity. So a lot of times leaders that are hired in schools, districts, boards are kind of liberal gatekeepers who know how to create the illusion that there's a commitment to racial equity while ensuring that there's no real commitment, no real shifts. And it's really difficult. So again, if you are a leader who has hiring power, you got to think of this in terms of a hiring issue, that you should not be, if you're a superintendent, you should not be hiring principals. If you say you're in an anti-racist institution, you should not be hiring principals who have not demonstrated that they are anti-racist. If I'm a teacher in a school, now I don't have the power to do the hiring, I'm the one getting hired. it is very difficult. One strategy is to organize the teachers in the school who are committed to this, and then think, okay, who is the next person above us in the power structure who is either committed to this or at least open to it? And we're going to work that person. That person is going to become our project, and we're going to work that person and prepare that person to address the next layer up of leadership. I know that sounds exhausting, but that's sort of one strategy. Another thing is to go outside the, if you can organize enough, look at who is at the board level who can support what what you're doing and working, sort of working that person. A lot of us are in situations where I just have to define my sphere of influence as my own classroom, my own relationship with kids and families, and do the best I can do there and plant seeds wherever I can plant seeds, and maybe do some organizing with other teachers. And I know that's frustrating, but that's sometimes the best we can do in the immediate term.
Okay, so we're getting some really good questions here. Anti-racism work with racialized folks who have deeply internalized whiteness is extremely difficult to navigate, even more so than with the white liberal, especially when you're racialized yourself. So what advice would you have for that?
Ooh.
Yeah, there we go. Saving the best for the last.
That's a really hard question. And it's definitely something I've come up, I think partially trying to understand what's happening there. And I probably don't need to tell any of you that sometimes that's a coping mechanism, because white people racialized people who have internalized whiteness still are having to deal with the heaviness of white supremacy and racism in their lives, and it's sort of a coping mechanism to, maybe this will be a little bit easier, or I'll take some of the pressure off myself if I identify, on the side of whiteness. I don't know. I mean, all I can think of is that all of this work happens better in groups, and any of us individually trying to take something like that on just sounds so exhausting. I mean, I think a bigger philosophy that I work with is for people who are not part of the power structure, who don't have more power than I have, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time actually trying to push a boulder uphill. What I'm going to do is identify the people who are, rather than trying to spending all my energy convincing the people who have no intention of, trying to move people who have no intention of moving. What I'm going to do is work with people who are at least open to the conversation so I can get them moving a little, and then convince the people who are ready to move faster. And I don't know how helpful that is, but that's been really helpful in my own work, because I always felt responsible for, taking the people who want to argue that racism doesn't exist and convincing them that racism exists. But that is not an efficient or effective, approach to anti-racism. So that's another thing that makes me think of.
Okay, so the next question, our teaching staff is largely white, so there is worry that anti-racist initiatives will unfairly impact racialized teachers with respect to workload, spotlight, etc. So this has stymied some of the efforts to make change.
Well, I think there's a piece of that that is a pretty kind of evolved concern, because often what does happen is that the emotional labor and other kinds of labor are put on the backs of racialized people. So I think there needs to be coalitions of racialized people with white people, and white people willing to take on that emotional labor of working with other white people. Um, I think it's an interesting thing as a white person in this work, because I feel like I need to proactively do that work with other white people. I need to proactively do the work without always having to be prompted by people of color. I also have to be willing to defer to my racialized colleagues when it comes to when it comes to the vision and the direction that the racial justice work can take. But that doesn't mean that I'm kind of sitting around waiting. I've got to both be cognizant of how racialized people are defining what liberation looks like for them, but also proactively taking the load off in the sort of day-to-day work of racial justice work in my institution, that I need to constantly be both doing, taking that work to white colleagues, and also committing to doing the challenging and saying the hard things and making people uncomfortable, so I can redirect some of the scorn off of my racialized colleagues and onto my self. So if there's a thoughtful way to move forward, I think, you got to move forward. But I think that concern, that whoever shared that concern, I think is, a very powerful thing to reflect on as you move forward.
So here's a question that I think is probably on everybody's minds and could frame another hour conversation. How do we create the urgency that is now or never?
Well, the urgency already exists. The problem is that it doesn't exist in all the right people. And the other problem is the expression of the urgency is often punished rather than rewarded. But I don't really know that I have an answer to that. I know people have different philosophies on that. Some people, their philosophy is that you create the urgency by convincing white people that it's in their best interest, that they're being damaged by structural racism. They're being spiritually damaged, or however else damaged. I don't know. There's just a thing about that that's recentering whiteness in a way that doesn't feel right to me, although I agree in principle that uh, that everyone is damaged by racism in some way. I think it's just continuing to plant seeds. I think it's sharing the stories of students, being able to do that in a way that, again, is not sucking the life out of the students and requiring them to spend all kinds. I see a lot of these things where they'll do like these student fish bowls, where they'll have a group of students come in and do like a focus group where teachers are kind of listening in on their focus group, or doing a student panel, and students are like pouring themselves onto the floor, and with no guarantee that anything's going to change about policy or practice. And again, it's just seen as kind of a cool student voice thing. But if you're able to do something like that and guarantee that you're going to create change based on student voice can be very powerful. So those are some of the things that come to mind. Sometimes, what it takes is public shaming, to be honest. It's like, if you are not, if you're not, if I can't find some way to make you ashamed of what you're doing, then you're not going to have the urgency. I know in the US, a lot of the urgency is created because there are lawsuits or threats of lawsuits against schools, school districts, school boards for failing to do what they ought to be doing around equity.
Just responding to someone right now. So I think that was kind of one of the major questions. And in terms of, back to the whole idea of challenging and speaking to administrators around the structural pieces, is there anything else that can be done when, the clear priority for them is a lot of the detours that we've talked about today, and also just when you experience and you hear those just blatant racist comments, and so that subtly and not so subtly there is an agenda and a conviction to not do this work. So what do you do with those leaders and those administrators that you're trying to make some headway with?
Well, I would sort of go back to the strategy of finding, maybe it's not the principal, maybe it's, but who is it in the school? Who can I identify who is somewhere in the power structure who will engage the deepest, and how do I work that person so that I can get that person on board to help me work whoever has more power. Again, I know that sounds tedious, but I think also a strategy that I've seen work is having coalitions of parents. Because if you have parents threatening to go to the media, then it's, an embarrassment. Although I also have to say there are districts and boards in Ontario for whom none of these things have seemed to work. I don't know, but what's happening in those places, I think, is a lot of organizing, a lot of, going to the media, a lot of building coalitions. But I think in an individual school, who is the person highest in the power structure who I can work on with this, who's open enough, and I can, help give them the skills to work it further up the power chain.
Absolutely. And I think what you just mentioned, we've had a lot of experience with that with our school boards in Ontario. And it does feel, and it's just real, that you often have to expose the problems and the issues at a level where people can be part of that conversation. Whereas if you're just trying to have those conversations within the internal structure that you're working within, it often seems that it doesn't go anywhere. So depending on the extent of the issue and the prolonged nature of these equity detours kind of keeping things at bay, people do have to do what they have to do. I feel like we're actually 2 minutes away from our time. So if you have any final comments, Paul, I have lots of questions about ideology, especially as we're in a time that is so unlike other times. We know what's happening in the US and the unleashing of hatred and racism and xenophobia, and even under COVID situations. I don't know. Sometimes people have said it brings out the best in us and it brings out the worst in us. And
Yeah.
we are worried about what happens next.
So I guess, to me, my thought right now is for those of us who are committed to equity, see ourselves as kind of the people who are trying to push the change forward around this. I think, rather than thinking externally, I would just do one more internal reflection is, how can I keep an eye on myself to make sure that I'm not following these detours, make sure that what I'm doing is as transformative as it can be, and then how can I sort of take that message and approach and build a network, or be part of a network of people who are embracing that approach. I guess I'll end by saying a couple of things. For those of you who are in Canada, I really encourage you to check out the thing that I'm doing with 3 people who are in Ontario, 3 badass social justice women, Pamela, Deb, and Kika. We're doing this program called 4 Big Questions on Racial Justice and Education, where we're doing a series of 4 1-hour webinars where each of them is the 4 of us discussing one question about racial justice education. It's every Thursday night in May. The first one is this coming Thursday night, where we'll discuss what are the biggest barriers to racial justice in education. So it's called 4 Big Questions. If you want to learn about that, you can email me or connect with me on Twitter. I also would encourage you all to go to the Equity Literacy Institute webpage. I've designed and made available 2 free self-paced courses, 2-hour professional development courses that people can take, and feel free to share that within, among your colleagues. They're totally free. There's one that costs a little bit of money. I think it's $5, which is a 2-hour online workshop specifically about deficit ideology as well. So here's how you can reach out to me. Feel free to reach out anytime. And I have to jump on another webinar right now, but thank you all, and I hope to hear from you. And I hope to see you at our rescheduled dates.
Yes, we'll see you in November. Thanks, Paul. We know that you need to run. I just wanted to say to people that you have information about the rescheduled webinar. We'll be in touch for those of you who don't intend to participate or are not sure of their schedules at that time. You can reach out to me specifically. And the other piece, we just wanted to remind people that if you do need to cancel your registration and get your refund, you can certainly do that. And I can send out the information to everyone regarding the 4-part question series that Paul is doing with our kick-ass educators in Ontario, incredible women who are doing great work. So I can do that when we finish the webinar today. So have a great weekend. Thanks again for your time, and we'll stay in touch as always. Take care, everybody. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.